and I saw a graph that talked about the University of California at Berkeley, and it showed the entrance of children of all races at Berkeley. And interestingly enough, you saw where the Asian American children had surpassed the white children in terms of entrance. And the white children had decreased from 60 in 1978, 60%, down to about 40%. But also interestingly, you saw where the Hispanics and the blacks in 1978 had about 4% of the student body at Berkeley. But now in 1998, the Hispanics have 12% and the blacks have something like 6%. In other words, we have not thrived. And I think this is a point that you can see all across the country in terms of education and some other things. Now, there's some news that comes out now that tells us that the amount of teenage pregnancy in the black children has dropped, and that sounds like it's good. They tell us that the homicide rate has dropped, and that sounds like it's good. But when we look at the things like education, where we're really not moving upward like we want to do, when we look at the economics, where we don't have jobs and things are not working out well for us, when we look at where we are in terms of our own self-determination, all of these things which are the goals of the black people, starting from slavery, then you have to say that the conditions may not be as good for the kids in the 90s as, let's say, we had proposed them to be in the 1960s. So I'm concerned that there might be some things that we need to be doing and thinking about in terms of moving our children ahead. I'm concerned that we're too much involved in a discussion on racism, when I don't think that's a term that needs to be discussed. I think it's a given. The issue is that there has been a war waged on black people since 1960. And no one has looked at the devastation from that war. No one has begun to even look at who waged the war against us. And no one has looked at how do you rehabilitate a people as a result of that war. The civil rights struggle in 1968 was stopped. And it was stopped cold in its tracks somewhere by the 1970s. That was done with gangs. Now the gangs were organized to stop the civil rights movement, and they did. Now the question is, who organized the gangs? Nobody wants to say, but we know. The gangs also got involved when we were in our economic development and accumulating properties and land in the inner city. The gangs were just as involved in stopping that as the Department of Agriculture was in stopping black farmers from keeping their lands in the South. So we're losing land both in the city and in the country.
Can I ask you something? You know, I guess they said they stopped the Black Panthers, and they was doing a good job back in the 60s by the breakfast program and all that. But now, but they couldn't stop the gangs. But I know we didn't start the gangs. Can you tell me how did it?
Well, yeah, see, when you look at the removal of the Black Panthers, the children that they had organized to work with them became co-opted and turned into gangs. Now, what they will do to confuse you is to make you think that the gangs of the 70s were equal to the gangs of the 50s. They're not. The gangs of the 50s was a natural social organization amongst black children, black young people. They did that. But the gangs of the 70s was a federal organization, a military organization, and the children had nothing to do with that.
Did they come in with drugs?
Well, the drugs came later. You see, the drugs at first were aimed at the white children, predominantly, but the drugs came a little bit later. But once the gangs got moving good and they stopped the civil rights movement and turned everybody out of the city, so we began to give up land. So, in other words, the urban renewal issue was able to move. Then the drugs came. Now, when the drugs came, that began to bring another issue in, and that meant in terms of changing the economy of the black community. So we were no longer in industry, General Motors, working those kinds of jobs. Most were unemployed, and for the young, it was pulling them out of school, so they didn't even finish school, to start selling drugs and dealing with drugs. But in the same respect, that gave reason to do one of two things. Number one, create a bad name for African-American people all over the world, so you lost respect. And the next thing was the building of jails. Now, when you look at the building of jails, if you take the jail statistic and look at that Berkeley statistic, then you'll see it right side up, meaning that if you add our the kids in jail to our kids at Berkeley, then we'll begin to equal the populations of the Asians and the whites. So what we're saying then is that the devastation that was done during the war did more to destroy our young people and put them in jail than it did in terms of getting them ready for school. But what is going to turn that around? and that's the question I raise, who is working now to turn that around? It can't be done by these little nickel and dime programs that the government is throwing out in terms of a program that'll last for a year and another program that lasts for 3 months. You see what I mean?
I mean, is that? I mean, I want to just say something about the fire this time, the documentary. Now, using that documentary, and you mentioned that the future with for the black folks, black people, was General Motors in the '60s.
Or some kind of industry.
Right. Okay. And then it came up to be the future for the black people was Martin Luther King and the hospitals and stuff. And now I say like on Alameda and Imperial, the future for the black people now is the penitentiaries.
Right. The idea being, see, if you say that there was a war waged, then there's a plan. So whoever the general that's fighting you has a plan. If you are at war with them, you have a plan. If you are not at war, but war is waged upon you, you live without a plan. Now, when we started the civil rights movement, we didn't see it as a war, but we had a hope, and one of the hopes was employment, decent employment, such as with General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, any kind of industry that was going to give money, right? Now, out of that also, we looked at, in Watts, the building of the hospital that was going to raise the health care, but also be a place for employment, as well as an opportunity for education for our young people. Well, before long, all of that got wiped out. Now, if you look at the other plan, then you say, well, okay, you got the hospital, but was that the intent to give you good health, or the intent to give you employment, or the intent to give you education, or was that built to just keep you quiet?
Was that built for us to get shot up and
go in? No, it was built to keep you quiet.
Oh, okay.
Okay. In the meantime, the other plan comes that starts undermining your children and bringing them the guns and bringing them the drugs, but the big thing comes now is the penitentiary. And so if you look out the window of Martin Luther King Hospital, you'll see the penitentiary right out the window, which becomes the new hope, but it's not your hope. You follow? In other words, that is a part of the war plan that it puts your children there instead of putting your children in a more viable situation. Now, the reason I raise that is that if we don't wake up in the 90s, we're going to find that we're going to lose a lot of things as far as our young people are concerned. The downward trend of teenage pregnancy may not be a good sign. The idea that the homicides at this point have gone down may not be a good sign. And the reason I raise that is because the suicide rates are beginning to climb. That's a sign of depression. So in other words, it's not strength. That these things don't necessarily represent strength. They may represent weakness. My major contention is that there should be a program comparable to the Marshall Plan that was put out for Europe after the Second World War to rehabilitate Germany, France, Italy, Holland, Belgium, and all those countries that were destroyed as a result of the war with Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. That's a similar kind of program needs to be given to the African Americans because we are coming out of a war that was just as devastating to us as that other war was to the Europeans. Now, people would not like to agree with that because that would imply that the government of the United States or some kind of government somewhere waged a war that was destructive to the African American people, destructive enough to make them equal to being in slavery. No one wants to take that weight, but the fact is it's true. So at some point in time, then people would have to begin to deal with that and make that actually the issue. Not remunerations from slavery, because that's something that you know has to be on the back burner, but just what was done in the last 30 years. And I'm saying this because it's very important if we're going to pull our young people up, that they can become viable and feel good about themselves with self-esteem and begin to bind the wounds of the things that have happened to us in the last 30 years. We have drug babies. We have children who have not had proper nurturing. We can hardly distinguish between the kids that have been damaged by drugs in utero as against not having gotten proper nurturing from their mothers after birth. All of these children need to be healed. We have so many adolescents and young people who have been raised haphazardly. All of that needs to be, addressed.
Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just say, if there's anybody that hears something that you want to